Welcome. This reading contains excerpts from the Psychopathology of Everyday Life by Sigmund Freud, 1901, which is in the public domain. The full text is available freely via Project Gutenberg at https://www.gutenberg.org/ebook/56550. Chapter 4: Childhood and Concealing Memories. In a second essay, I was able to demonstrate the purposive nature of our memories in an unexpected field. I started with the remarkable fact that the earliest recollections of a person often seem to preserve the unimportant and accidental, whereas frequently, though not universally not, a trace is found in the adult memory of the weighty and effective impressions of this period, as it is known that the memory exercises a certain selection among the impressions at its disposal. It would seem logical to suppose that this selection follows entirely different principles in childhood than at the time of intellectual maturity. However, close investigation points to the fact that such an assumption is superfluous. The indifferent childhood memories owe their existence to a process of displacement. It may be shown by psychoanalysis that in their reproduction, they represent the substitute for other really significant impressions, whose direct reproduction is hindered by some resistance, as they do not owe their existence to their own contents, but to an associative relation of their contents to another repressed thought. They deserve the title of concealing memories, by which I have designated them. In the aforementioned essay, I only touched upon, but in no way exhausted, the varieties in the relations and meanings of concealed memories. In the given example fully analyzed, I particularly emphasized peculiarity in the temporal relation between the concealing memory and the contents of the memory concealed by it. The content of the concealing memory in that example belonged to one of the first years of childhood, while the thoughts represented by it, which remained practically unconscious, belonged to later period of the individual in question. I called this form of displacement retroactive or regressive one. Perhaps more often one finds the reversed relation. That is, an indifferent impression of the most remote period comes concealing memory in consciousness, which simply owes its existence to an association with an earlier experience against whose direct reproduction there are resistances. We would call these encroaching or interposing concealing memories. What most concerns the memory lies here chronologically beyond the concealing memory. Finally, there may be a third possible case, namely, the concealing memory may be connected with the impression it conceals, not only through its contents, but also through contiguity of time. This is the contemporaneous or contiguous concealing memory. How large a portion of the sum total of our memory belongs to the category of concealing memories, and what part it plays in various neurotic hidden processes. These are problems into the value of which I have neither inquired nor shall enter here. I am concerned only with emphasizing the sameness between the forgetting of proper names with faulty recollection and the formation of concealing memories. At first sight it would seem that the diversities of both phenomena are far more striking than their exact analogies. There we deal with proper names, here with complete impressions experienced either in reality or in thought. There we deal with manifest failure of the memory function, here with memory act which appears strange to us. Again, there we are concerned with momentary disturbance, for the name just forgotten could have been reproduced correctly 100 times before, and will be so again from tomorrow on. Here we deal with lasting possession without failure, for the indifferent childhood memories seem to be able to accompany us throughout great part of life. In both these cases the riddle seems to be solved in an entirely different way. There it is the forgetting, while here it is the remembering which excites our scientific curiosity. After deeper reflection one realizes that, although there is a diversity in the psychic material and in the duration of time of the two phenomena, yet these are by far outweighed by the conformities between the two. In both cases we deal with the failure of remembering. What should be correctly reproduced by the memory fails to appear, and instead something else comes as a substitute. In the case of forgetting a name, there is no lack of memory function in the form of name substitution. The formation of a concealing memory depends on the forgetting of other important impressions. In both cases we are reminded by an intellectual feeling of the intervention of a disturbance, which in each case takes a different form. In the case of forgetting of names we are aware that the substitutive names are incorrect, while in concealing memories we are surprised that we have them at all. Hence, if psychologic analysis demonstrates that the substitutive formation in each case is brought about in the same manner, that is, through displacement along superficial association, we are justified in saying that the diversities in material, in duration of time, and in the centering of both phenomena serve to enhance our expectation that we have discovered something that is important and of general value. This generality purports that the stopping and straying of the reproducing function indicates more often than we suppose that there is an intervention of prejudicial factor, a tendency which favors one memory and at the same time works against another. The subject of childhood memories appears to me so important and interesting that I would like to devote to it few additional remarks which go beyond the views expressed so far. How far back into childhood do our memories reach? I am familiar with some investigations on this question by V. and C. Henry and Potwin. They assert that such examinations show wide individual variations, inasmuch as some trace their first reminiscences to the 6th month of life, while others can recall nothing of their lives before the end of the 6th or even the 8th year. But what connection is there between these variations in the behavior of childhood reminiscences, and what signification may be ascribed to them? It seems that it is not enough to procure the material for this question by simple inquiry, but it must later be subjected to a study in which the person furnishing the information must participate. I believe we accept too indifferently the fact of infantile amnesia, that is, the failure of memory for the first years of our lives, and fail to find in its strange riddle. We forget of what great intellectual accomplishments and of what complicated emotions a child of 4 years is capable. We really ought to wonder why the memory of later years has, as our rule, retained so little of these psychic processes, especially as we have every reason for assuming that these same forgotten childhood activities have not glided off without leaving trace in the development of the person, but that they have left definite influence for all future time. Yet in spite of this unparalleled effectiveness, they were forgotten. This would suggest that there are particularly formed conditions of memory, in the sense of conscious reproduction, which have thus far eluded our knowledge. It is quite possible that the forgetting of childhood may give us the key to the understanding of those amnesias which, according to our newer studies, lie at the basis of the formation of all neurotic symptoms. These retained childhood reminiscences, some appear to us readily comprehensible, while others seem strange or unintelligible. It is not difficult to correct certain errors in regard to both kinds. If the retained reminiscences of a person are subjected to an analytic test, it can be readily ascertained that a guarantee for their correctness does not exist. Some of the memory pictures are surely falsified and incomplete, or displaced in point of time and place. The assertions of persons examined that their first memories reach back perhaps to their 2nd year are evidently unreliable. Motives can soon be discovered which explain the disfigurement and the displacement of these experiences, but they also demonstrate that these memory lapses are not the result of a mere unreliable memory. Powerful forces from a later period have molded the memory capacity of our infantile experiences, and it is probably due to the same forces that the understanding of our childhood is generally so very strange to us. The recollection of adults, as is known, proceeds through different psychic material. Some recall by means of visual pictures. Their memories are of visual character. Other individuals can scarcely reproduce in memory the most paltry sketch of an experience. We call such persons auditives and mutters in contrast to the visuals, terms proposed by Charcot. These differences vanish in dreams. All our dreams are preponderatingly visual, but this development is also found in the childhood memories. The latter are plastic and visual, even in those people whose later memory lacks the visual element. The visual memory, therefore, preserves the type of the infantile recollections. Only my earliest childhood memories are of a visual character. They represent plastically depicted scenes, comparable only to stage settings. In these scenes of childhood, whether they prove true or false, one usually sees his own childish person both in contour and dress. This circumstance must excite our wonder, for adults do not see their own persons in their recollections of later experiences. It is, moreover, against our experiences to assume that the child's attention during his experiences is centered on himself rather than exclusively on outside impressions. Various sources force us to assume that the so-called earliest childhood recollections are not true memory traces but later elaborations of the same, elaborations which might have been subjected to the influences of many later psychic forces. Thus the childhood reminiscences of individuals altogether advance to the signification of concealing memories, and thereby form noteworthy analogy to the childhood reminiscences as laid down in the legends and myths of nations. Whoever hath examined mentally a number of persons by the method of psychoanalysis must have gathered in this work numerous examples of concealing memories of every description. However, owing to the previously discussed nature of the relations of the childhood reminiscences to later life, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to report such examples. For, in order to attach the value of the concealing memory to an infantile reminiscence, it would be often necessary to present the entire life history of the person concerned. Only seldom is it possible, as in the following good example, to take out from its context and report single childhood memory. 24-year-old man preserved the following picture from the 5th year of his life. In the Garden of Oz summer house he sat on stool next to his aunt, who was engaged in teaching him the alphabet. He found difficulty in distinguishing the letter M from N, and he begged his aunt to tell him how to tell one from the other. His aunt called his attention to the fact that the letter M had one whole portion, a stroke, more than the letter N. There was no reason to dispute the reliability of this childhood recollection. Its meaning, however, was discovered only later, when it showed itself to be the symbolic representation of another boyish inquisitiveness. For just as he wanted to know the difference between M and N at that time, so he concerned himself later about the difference between boy and girl, and he would have been willing that just his aunt should be his teacher. He also discovered that the difference was a similar one in that the boy again had one whole portion more than the girl, and at the time of this recognition his memory awoke to the corresponding childish inquisitiveness. I would like to show by one more example the sense that may be gained by a childhood reminiscence through analytic work, although it may seem to contain no sense before, in my 43rd year, when I began to interest myself in what remained in my memory of my own childhood, a scene struck me which for a long time, as I afterwards believed, had repeatedly come to consciousness, and which through reliable identification could be traced to a period before the completion of my 3rd year. I saw myself in front of a chest, the door of which was held open by my half-brother, 20 years my senior. I stood there demanding something and screaming, and my mother, pretty and slender, then suddenly entered the room as if returning from the street. In these words I formulated this scene so vividly seen, which, however, furnished no other clue. Whether my brother wished to open or lock the chest, in the first explanation it was a cupboard, why I cried, and what bearing the arrival of my mother had, all these questions were din to me. I was tempted to explain to myself that it dealt with the memory of hawks by my older brother, which was interrupted by my mother. Such misunderstandings of childhood scenes retained in memory are not uncommon. We recall a situation, but it is not centralized. We do not know on which of the elements to place the psychic accent. Analytic effort led me to an entirely unexpected solution of the picture. I missed my mother and began to suspect that she was locked in this cupboard or chest, and therefore demanded that my brother should unlock it. As he obliged me, and I became convinced that she was not in the chest, I began to cry. This is the moment firmly retained in the memory, which was directly followed by the appearance of my mother, who appeased my worry and anxiety. But how did the child get the idea of looking for the absent mother in the chest? Dreams which occurred at the same time pointed dimly to nurse, concerning whom other reminiscences were retained, as, for example, that she conscientiously urged me to deliver to her the small coins which I received as gifts, detail which in itself may lay claim to the value of concealing memory for later things. I then concluded to facilitate for myself this time the task of interpretation, and asked my now aged mother about that nurse. I found out all sorts of things, among others the fact that this shrewd but dishonest person had committed extensive robberies during the confinement of my mother, and that my half-brother was instrumental in bringing her to justice. This information gave me the key to the scene from childhood, as through a sort of inspiration. The sudden disappearance of the nurse was not a matter of indifference to me. I had just asked this brother where she was, probably because I had noticed that he had played a part in her disappearance, and he, evasive and witty as he is to this day, answered that she was boxed in. I understood this answer in the childish way, but asked no more, as there was nothing else to be discovered. When my mother left me shortly thereafter, I suspected that the naughty brother had treated her in the same way as he did the nurse, and therefore pressed him to open the chest. I also understand now why in the translation of the visual childhood scene my mother's slenderness was accentuated. She must have struck me as being newly restored. I am 2.5 years older than the sister born at that time, and when I was 3 years of age I was separated from my half-brother. Chapter 5: Mistakes in Speech. Although the ordinary material of speech of our mother tongue seems to be guarded against forgetting, its application, however, more often succumbs to another disturbance which is familiar to us as slips of the tongue. What we observe in normal persons as slips of the tongue gives the same impression as the first step of the so-called paraphasias which manifest themselves under pathologic conditions. I am in the exceptional position of being about to refer to previous work on the subject. In the year 1895, Meringer and C. Mayer published a study on mistakes in speech and reading, with whose viewpoints I do not agree. One of the authors, who is the spokesman in the text, is philologist actuated by linguistic interest to examine the rules governing those slips. He hoped to deduce from these rules the existence of definite psychic mechanism, whereby the sounds of word, of sentence, and even the words themselves, would be associated and connected with one another in quite peculiar manner. The authors grouped the examples of speech mistakes collected by them first according to purely descriptive viewpoints, such as interchanging z. G. The Milo of Venus instead of the Venus of Milo as anticipation z. G. The shoes made her sore. The shoes made her feet sore as echoes and postpositions. Intamination z. G. I will soon him home instead of I will soon go home and I will see him. And substitution z. G. He entrusted his money to savings crank instead of a savings bank. Besides these principal categories, there are some others of lesser importance or of lesser significance for our purpose. In this grouping, it makes no difference whether the transposition, disfigurement, fusion, etc. affects single sounds of the word or syllables, or whole words of the concerned sentence. To explain the various forms of mistakes in speech, Mehringer assumes a varied psychic value of phonetics. As soon as the innervation affects the first syllable of a word or the first word of a sentence, the stimulating process immediately strikes the succeeding sounds and the following words, and insofar as these innervations are synchronous, they may effect some changes in one another. The stimulus of the psychically more intensive sound rings before or continue echoing, and thus disturbs the less important process of innervation. It is necessary, therefore, to determine which are the most important sounds of word. Mehringer states, if one wishes to know which sound of word possesses the greatest intensity, he should examine himself while searching for forgotten word, for example, name. That which first returns to consciousness invariably had the greatest intensity prior to the forgetting. Thus the most important sounds are the initial sound of the root syllable and the initial sound of the word itself, as well as one or another of the accentuated vowels. Here I cannot help voicing contradiction. Whether or not the initial sound of the name belongs to the most important elements of the word, it is surely not true that in the case of the forgetting of the word it first returns to consciousness. The above rule is therefore of no use. When we observe ourselves during the search for forgotten name, we are imperatively often forced to express the opinion that it begins with certain letter. This conviction proves to be as often unfounded as founded. Indeed, I would even go so far as to assert that in the majority of cases one reproduces false initial sound. Also in our example, Signorelli, the substitutive name lacked the initial sound, and the principal syllables were lost. On the other hand, the less important pair of syllables Ellie returned to consciousness in the substitutive name Botticelli. How little substitutive names respect the initial sound of the lost names may be learned from the following case. One day I found it impossible to recall the name of the small country whose capital is Monte Carlo. The substitutive names were as follows: Piedmont, Albania, Montevideo, Calico. In place of Albania, Montenegro soon appeared, and then it struck me that the syllable Mon, pronounced Mon, occurred in all but the last of the substitutive names. It thus became easy for me to find from the name of Prince Albert the forgotten name Monaco. Calico practically imitates the syllabic sequence and rhythm of the forgotten name. If we admit the conjecture that a mechanism similar to that pointed out in the forgetting of names may also play a part in the phenomena of speech blunders, we are then led to a better founded judgment of cases of speech blunders. The speech disturbance which manifests itself as speech blunder may in the first place be caused by the influence of another component of the same speech, that is, through a foresound or an echo, or through another meaning within the sentence or context which differs from that which the speaker wishes to utter. In the second place, however, the disturbance could be brought about analogously to the process in the case Signorelli, through influences outside this word, sentence, or context, from elements which we did not intend to express, and of whose incitement we became conscious only through the disturbance. In both modes of origin of the mistake in speech, the common element lies in the simultaneity of the stimulus, while the differentiating elements lie in the arrangement within or without the same sentence or context. The difference does not at first appear as wide as when it is taken into consideration in certain conclusions drawn from the symptomatology of speech mistakes. It is clear, however, that only in the first case is there a prospect of drawing conclusions from the manifestations of speech blunders concerning a mechanism which connects together sounds and words for the reciprocal influence of their articulation, that is, conclusions such as the philologist hopes to gain from study of speech blunders. In the case of disturbance through influence outside of the same sentence or context, it would before all be a question of becoming acquainted with the disturbing elements, and then the question would arise whether the mechanism of this disturbance cannot also suggest the probable laws of the formation of speech. We cannot maintain that Mehringer and Mayer have overlooked the possibility of speech disturbance through complicated psychic influences, that is, through elements outside of the same word or sentence or the same sequence of words. Indeed, It must have observed that the theory of the psychic variation of sounds applies, strictly speaking, only to the explanation of sound disturbances as well as to foresounds and aftersounds, where the word disturbances cannot be reduced to sound disturbances, as, for example, in the substitutions and contaminations of words. They, too, have without hesitation sought the cause of the mistake in speech outside of the intended context and proved the state of affairs by means of fitting examples. According to the author's own understanding, it is some similarity between certain word in the intended sentence and some other not intended, which allows the latter to assert itself in consciousness by causing a disfigurement, composition, or compromise formation, contamination. Now, in my work on the interpretation of dreams, I have shown the part played by the process of condensation in the origin of the so-called manifest contents of the dream from the latent thoughts of the dream. Any similarity of objects or word presentations between two elements of the unconscious material is taken as a cause for the formation of a third, which is a composite or compromise formation. This element represents both components in the dream content, and in view of this origin, it is frequently endowed with numerous contradictory individual determinants. The formation of substitutions and contaminations and speech mistakes is, therefore, beginning of that work of condensation which we find taking a most active part in the construction of the dream. In a small essay destined for the general reader, Muringer advanced a theory of very practical significance for certain cases of interchanging of words, especially for such cases where one word is substituted by another of opposite meaning. He says, "We may still recall the manner in which the President of the Austrian House of Deputies opened the session some time ago. Honored sirs, I announce the presence of so and so many gentlemen, and therefore declare the session is closed." The general merriment first attracted his attention, and he corrected his mistake. In the present case, the probable explanation is that the President wished himself in position to close this session, from which he had little good to expect, and the thought broke through at least partially. Frequent manifestation, resulting in his use of, closed in place of, opened, that is, the opposite of the statement intended. Numerous observations have taught me, however, that we frequently interchange contrasting words. They are already associated in our speech consciousness. They lie very close together and are easily incorrectly evoked. Still, not in all cases of contrast substitution is it so simple as in the example of the President as to appear plausible that the speech mistake occurs merely as a contradiction which arises in the inner thought of the speaker opposing the sentence uttered. We have found the analogous mechanism in the analysis of the example aliquis, that the inner contradiction asserts itself in the form of forgetting a word instead of a substitution through its opposite. But in order to just difference, we may remark that the little word aliquis is incapable of a contrast similar to closing and opening, and that the word opening cannot be subject to forgetting on account of its being common component of speech, having been shown by the last examples of Muringer and Mayer that speech disturbance may be caused through the influence of foresounds, aftersounds, words from the same sentence that were intended for expression, as well as through the effect of words outside the sentence intended, the stimulus of which would otherwise not have been suspected. We shall next wish to discover whether we can definitely separate the two classes of mistakes in speech, and how we can distinguish the example of the one from a case of the other class. But at this stage of the discussion we must also think of the assertions of one who deals with the manifestations of speech mistakes in his recent work on the development of language. Psychic influences, according to one, never lack in these as well as in other phenomena related to them. The uninhibited stream of sound and word association stimulated by spoken sounds belongs here in the first place as a positive determinant. Still, not in all cases of contrast substitution is it so simple as in the example of the President as to appear plausible that the speech mistake occurs merely as a contradiction which arises in the inner thought of the speaker opposing the sentence uttered. We have found the analogous mechanism in the analysis of the example aliquis, that the inner contradiction asserts itself in the form of forgetting a word instead of a substitution through its opposite. But in order to just difference, we may remark that the little word aliquis is incapable of a contrast similar to closing and opening, and that the word opening cannot be subject to forgetting on account of its being common component of speech, having been shown by the last examples of Muringer and Mayer that speech disturbance may be caused through the influence of foresounds, aftersounds, words from the same sentence that were intended for expression, as well as through the effect of words outside the sentence intended, the stimulus of which would otherwise not have been suspected. We shall next wish to discover whether we can definitely separate the two classes of mistakes in speech, and how we can distinguish the example of the one from a case of the other class. But at this stage of the discussion we must also think of the assertions of one who deals with the manifestations of speech mistakes in his recent work on the development of language. Psychic influences. According to one, never lacking these as well as in other phenomena related to them. The uninhibited stream of sound and word association stimulated by spoken sounds belongs here in the first place as a positive determinant. The disturbing element is either a single unconscious thought, which comes to light through the speech blunder and can only be brought to consciousness through a searching analysis, or it is a more general psychic motive, which directs itself against the entire speech. Example A. Seeing my daughter make an unpleasant face while biting into an apple, I wish to quote the following couplet. The AP is a funny sight when in the apple he takes a bite, but I began the appel. This seems to be contamination of ape and apple compromise formation, or it may be also conceived as an anticipation of the prepared apple. The true state of affairs, however, was this. I began the quotation once before, and made no mistake the first time. I made the mistake only during the repetition, which was necessary because my daughter, having been distracted from another side, did not listen to me. This repetition, with the added impatience to disburden myself of the sentence, I must include in the motivation of the speech blunder, which represented itself as function of condensation. B. My daughter said. I wrote to Mrs. Schlesinger. The woman's name was Schlesinger. This speech blunder may depend on the tendency to facilitate articulation. I must state, however, that this mistake was made by my daughter a few moments after I had said appel instead of ape. Mistakes in speech are in great measure contagious. A similar peculiarity was noticed by Meringer and Mayer in the forgetting of names. I know of no reason for this psychic contagiousness. See, I set up like pocket knife, said patient in the beginning of treatment instead of. I shut up. This suggests difficulty of articulation, which may serve as an excuse for the interchanging of sounds. When her attention was called to the speech blunder, she promptly replied, Yes, that happened because you said earnest instead of earnest. As a matter of fact, I received her with the remark, Today we shall be in earnest, because it was the last hour before her discharge from treatment, and I jokingly changed the word into earnest. In the course of the hour, she repeatedly made mistakes in speech, and I finally observed that it was not only because she imitated me, but because she had special reason in her unconscious to linger at the word Ernst as name. D. A woman, speaking about a game invented by her children and called by them the man in the box, said the Manx in the box. I could readily understand her mistake. It was while analyzing her dream, in which her husband is depicted as very generous in money matters, just the reverse of reality, that she made this speech blunder. The day before she had asked for a new set of furs, which her husband denied her, claiming that he could not afford to spend so much money. She upbraided him for his stinginess, for putting away so much into the strong box, and mentioned friend whose husband is not nearly his income, and yet he presented his wife with mink coat for her birthday. The mistake is now comprehensible. The word Manx reduces itself to the minx which she longs for, and the box refers to her husband's stinginess. Example E. Similar mechanism is shown in the mistake of another patient whose memory deserted her in the midst of long-forgotten childish reminiscence. Her memory failed to inform her on what part of the body the prying, lustful hand of another had touched her. Soon thereafter she visited one of her friends, with whom she discussed summer homes, asked where her cottage in M. was located. She answered, near the mountain loin instead of a mountain lane. F. Another patient, whom I asked at the end of her visit how her uncle was, answered, I don't know. I only see him now in flagranti. The following day she said, I am really ashamed of myself for having given you yesterday such a stupid answer. Naturally you must have thought me a very uneducated person who always mistakes the meaning of foreign words. I wish to say en passant. We did not know at the time where she got the incorrectly used foreign words, but during the same session she reproduced. A reminiscence is a continuation of the theme from the previous day, in which being caught in flagrant he played the principal part. The mistake of the previous day had therefore anticipated the recollection, which at that time had not yet become conscious. G. In discussing her summer plans, a patient said, I shall remain most of the summer in Albalon. She noted her mistake and asked me to analyze it. The associations to Albalon elicited. Seashore on the Jersey coast summer resort vacation traveling. This recalled traveling in Europe with her cousin, topic which we had discussed the day before during the analysis of dream. The dream dealt with her dislike for this cousin, and she admitted that it was mainly due to the fact that the latter was a favorite of the man whom they met together while traveling abroad. During the dream analysis she could not recall the name of the city in which they met this man, and I did not make any effort at the time to bring it to her consciousness, as we were engrossed in a totally different problem. When asked to focus her attention again on Albalon and reproduce her associations, she said, It brings to mind Albalon lawn field. And Alberfield. Alberfeld was the lost name of the city in Germany. Here the mistake served to bring to consciousness in concealed manner memory which was connected with painful feeling. A woman said to me, if you wish to buy carpet, go to Merchant Kaufmann in Matthew Street, Mathos Gas. I repeated, then at Matthews. I mean at Merchant. It would seem that my repeating of one name in place of the other was simply the result of distraction. The woman's remark really did distract me as she turned my attention to something else much more vital to me than carpet. In Matthew Street stands the house in which my wife lived as bride. The entrance to the house was in another street, and now I noticed that I had forgotten its name and could only recall it through roundabout method. The name Matthew, which kept my attention, is thus substitutive name for the forgotten name of the street. It is more suitable than the name Merchant, for Matthew is exclusively the name of person, while Merchant is not. The forgotten street, too, bears the name of person, Radicke. Patient consulted me for the first time, and from her history it became apparent that the cause of her nervousness was largely an unhappy married life. Without any encouragement, she went into details about her marital troubles. She had not lived with her husband for about 6 months, and she saw him last at the theater, when she saw the play Officer 606. I called her attention to the mistake, and she immediately corrected herself, saying that she meant to say Officer 666, the name of a recent popular play. I decided to find out the reason for the mistake, and as the patient came to me for analytic treatment, I discovered that the immediate cause of the rupture between herself and husband was the disease which is treated by 606. Before calling on me, patient telephoned for an appointment and also wished to be informed about my consultation fee. He was told that the first consultation was $10. After the examination was over, he again asked what he was to pay and added, I don't like to owe money to anyone, especially to doctors. I prefer to pay right away. Instead of pay, he said play. His last voluntary remarks and his mistake put me on my guard, but after a few more uncalled for remarks, he set me at ease by taking money from his pocket. He counted 4 paper dollars and was very chagrined and surprised because he had no more money with him and promised to send me a check for the balance. I was sure that his mistake betrayed him, that he was only playing with me, but there was nothing to be done. At the end of a few weeks, I sent him a bill for the balance, and the letter was returned to me by the post office authorities. Mark, not found. Miss X spoke very warmly of Mr. Y, which was rather strange, as before this she had always expressed her indifference, not to say her contempt for him. On being asked about this sudden change of heart, she said, I really never had anything against him. He was always nice to me, but I never gave him the chance to cultivate my acquaintance. She said captivate. This neologism was contamination of cultivate and captivate, and foretold the coming betrothal. An illustration of the mechanisms of contamination and condensation will be found in the following lapsus linguae. Speaking of Miss C, Miss W depicted her as very straight-laced person who is not given to levities, etc. Miss X thereupon remarked, yes, that is very characteristic description. She always appealed to me as very straight-braced. Here the mistake resolved itself into straight-laced and brazen-faced, which corresponded. Miss W. Opinion of Miss Z. PG 88, and I shall quote a number of examples from paper by my colleague Dr. W. Steckel, which appeared in the Berlin Tageblatt of January 1904, entitled Unconscious Confessions. An unpleasant trick of my unpleasant thoughts was revealed by the following example. To begin with, I may state that in my capacity as physician I never consider my remuneration, but always keep in view patient's interest only. This goes without saying. I was visiting a patient who was convalescing from serious illness. We had passed through hard days and nights. I was happy to find her improved, and I portrayed to her the pleasures of sojourn in Béziers, concluding with, if, as I hope, you will not soon leave your bed. This obviously came from an unconscious selfish motive to be able to continue treating this wealthy patient, wish which is entirely foreign to my waking consciousness, and which I would reject with indignation. Oh, another example. Dr. W. Steckel. My wife engaged French governess for afternoons, and later, coming to satisfactory agreement, wished to retain her testimonials. The governess begged to be allowed to keep them, saying, G. Church on corpora lesse prismedes. Pardons, por less avenmides. She apparently intended to seek another place which would perhaps offer more profitable arrangements, an intention which she carried out. I was to give a lecture to a woman. Her husband, upon whose request this was done, stood behind the door listening. At the end of my sermonizing, which had made a visible impression, I said, Goodbye, sir. To the experienced person, I thus betrayed the fact that the words were directed towards the husband, that I had spoken to oblige him. Q. Dr. Steckel reports about himself that he had under treatment at the same time 2 patients from Trieste, each of whom he always addressed incorrectly. Good morning, Mr. Poloni, he would say to Ascoli, and to Poloni, good morning, Mr. Ascoli. He was at first inclined to attribute no deeper motive to this mistake, but to explain it through a number of similarities in both persons. However, he easily convinced himself that here the interchange of names bespoke sort of boast, that is, he was acquainting each of his Italian patients with the fact that neither was the only resident of Trieste who came to Vienna in search of his medical advice. 2 women stopped in front of a drugstore, and one said to her companion, "If you will wait a few moments I'll soon be back," but she said movements instead. She was on her way to buy some castoria for her child. Mr. L., who is fonder of being called on than of calling, spoke to me through the telephone from a nearby summer resort. He wanted to know when I would pay him a visit. I reminded him that it was his turn to visit me, and called his attention to the fact that, as he was the happy possessor of an automobile, it would be easier for him to call on me. We were at different summer resorts, separated by about 1/2 hour's railway trip. He gladly promised to call, and asked, "How about Labor Day, September 1st? Will it be convenient for you?" When I answered affirmatively, he said, "Very well, then put me down for Election Day." November. His mistake was quite plain. He likes to visit me, but it was inconvenient to travel so far. In November we would both be in the city. My analysis proved correct. Friend described to me nervous patient, and wished to know whether I could benefit him. I remarked, "I believe that in time I can remove all his symptoms by psychoanalysis, because it is durable case." Wishing to say curable, I repeatedly addressed my patient as Mrs. Smith, her married daughter's name, when her real name is Mrs. James. My attention having been called to it, I soon discovered that I had another patient of the same name who refused to pay for the treatment. Mrs. Smith was also my patient and paid her bills promptly. The lapsus linguae sometimes stands for particular characteristic. A young woman, who is the domineering spirit in her home, said of her ailing husband that he had consulted the doctor about wholesome diet for himself, and then added, "The doctor said that diet has nothing to do with his ailments, and that he can eat and drink what I want." I cannot omit this excellent and instructive example, although, according to my authority, it is about 20 years old. Lady once expressed herself in society. The very words show that they were uttered with fervor and under the pressure of great many secret emotions. Yes, woman must be pretty if she is to please the man. Man is much better off. As long as he has 5 straight limbs, he needs no more. This example affords us good insight into the intimate mechanisms of mistake in speech by means of condensation and contamination. It is quite obvious that we have here fusion of 2 similar modes of expression. As long as he has his 4 straight limbs, as long as he has all his 5 senses, or the term straight may be the common element of the 2 intended expressions, as long as he has his straight limbs. All 5 should be straight. It may also be assumed that both modes of expression, viz., those of the 5 senses and those of the straight 5, have cooperated to introduce into the sentence about the straight limbs first number and then the mysterious 5 instead of the simple 4. But this fusion surely would not have succeeded if it had not expressed good sense in the form resulting from the mistake, if it had not expressed cynical truth which, naturally, could not be uttered, unconcealed, coming as it did from all woman. Finally, we shall not hesitate to call attention to the fact that the woman saying, following its wording, could just as well be an excellent witticism as jocose speech blunder. It is simply a question whether she uttered these words with conscious or unconscious intention. The behavior of the speaker in this case certainly speaks against the conscious intention, and thus excludes way. Owing to similarity of material, I add here another case of speech blunder, the interpretation of which requires less skill. A professor of anatomy strove to explain the nostril, which, as is known, is a very difficult anatomical structure. To his question whether his audience grasped his ideas, he received an affirmative reply. The professor, known for his self-esteem, thereupon remarked, "I can hardly believe this, for the number of people who understand the nostril, even in a city of millions like Vienna, can be counted on I meant to say on the fingers of hand. Why, I am indebted to Dr. Alf Robitzek of Vienna for calling my attention to 2 speech blunders from an old French author, which I shall reproduce in the original. Brandtum, 1527 to 1614, Vice d'Estames Galantes. Hiscires second. Cig cognu untres bellet honest dame parlemon, gui divisin avic unhonest gentilhum like her des affairs leger durna ia civils, alaide. J. ali dire quella roi fait romper tous la si pays lat, al volet dire la ponce. Pensesque ven coucher davik son Mary, us sonjane son amant, avoiding corsi nam fries en libach. Adla genel homes nesho for en amers del porcima. Un otter dame que je I cognu, entre tenon un otter grain dame plus quel, et la one et exalt says butes, ali did apres. Non madam, si quid G vus endis, si ns point por vus adulter, volant dire adulator, camel la rebella ainsi. Penses quel songio et a adulterer. In the psychotherapeutic procedure which I employ in solution and removal of neurotic symptoms, I am often confronted with the task of discovering from the accidental utterances and fancies of the patient the thought contents, which, though striving for concealment, nevertheless unintentionally betray themselves. In English, French translation, Brandt 1527 to 1614 Lives of the Gallant Lady's Second Discourse. If I had met very beautiful and honest lady in the world, who, conversing with an honest gentleman of the court about the affairs of the war during these civil affairs, she said to him, I have heard it said that the king has caused all the sea of that country to be broken. She meant the bridges. Think that, having just slept with her mare, or thinking of her lover, she had this name fresh in her mouth, and the gentleman became inflamed in love with her for this word. Another lady whom I have struck, conversing with another great lady more than herself, and praising and exalting her beauties, she said to her afterwards, No, madam, what I tell you about it is not to adulterate you, and meaning to adulate, as she dressed him thus. Think that she was thinking of adulterating. In doing this the mistakes often perform the most valuable service, as I can show through most convincing and still most singular examples. For example, patients speak of an aunt and later, without noting the mistake, call her my mother or designate husband as brother. In this way they attract my attention to the fact that they have identified these persons with each other, that they have placed them in the same category, which for their emotional life signifies recurrence of the same type, or a young man of 20 years presents himself during my office hours with these words, I am the father of N, and whom you have treated. Pardon me, I mean the brother, and why, he is 4 years older than I. I understand through this mistake that he wishes to express that, like the brother, he too is ill through the fault of the father. Like his brother, he wishes to be cured, but that the father is the one most in need of treatment. At other times an unusual arrangement of words, or forced expression, is sufficient to disclose in the speech of the patient the participation of repressed thought having different motive. Hence, in coarse as well as in finer speech disturbances, which may, nevertheless, be subsumed as speech blunders. I find that it is not the contact effects of the sound, but the thoughts outside the intended speech, which determine the origin of the speech blunder and also suffice to explain the newly formed mistakes in speech. I do not doubt the laws whereby the sounds produce changes upon one another, but they alone do not appear to me sufficiently forcible to mar the correct execution of speech. In those cases which I have studied and investigated more closely, they merely represent the performed mechanism, which is conveniently utilized by more remote psychic motive. The latter does not, however, form a part of the sphere of influence of these sound relations. In a large number of substitutions caused by mistakes in talking there is an entire absence of such phonetic laws. In this respect I am in full accord with one who likewise assumes that the conditions underlying speech blunders are complex and go far beyond the contact effect of the sounds. If I accept as certain these more remote psychic influences, following one expression, there is still nothing to detain me from conceding also that in accelerated speech, with a certain amount of diverted attention, the causes of speech blunder may be easily limited to the definite law of Meringer and Mayer. However, in number of examples gathered by these authors, more complicated solution is quite apparent. In some forms of speech blunders, we may assume that the disturbing factor is the result of striking against obscene words and meanings, purposive disfigurement and distortion of words and phrases, which is so popular with vulgar persons, aims at nothing else but the employing of harmless motive as our reminder of the obscene, and this sport is so frequent that it would not be at all remarkable if it appeared unintentionally and contrary to the will. I trust that the readers will not depreciate the value of these interpretations, for which there is no proof, and of these examples which I have myself collected and explained by means of analysis. But if secretly I still cherish the expectation that even the apparently simple cases of speech blunder will be traced to disturbance caused by half-repressed idea outside of the intended context, I am tempted to it by a noteworthy observation of Meringer. This author asserts that it is remarkable that nobody wishes to admit having made a mistake in speaking. There are many intelligent and honest people who are offended if we tell them that they made a mistake in speaking. I would not risk making this assertion as general as does Meringer using the term. Nobody, but the emotional trace which clings to the demonstration of the mistake, which manifestly belongs to the nature of shame, has its significance. It may be classed with the anger displayed at the inability to recall a forgotten name, and with the surprise at the tenaciousness of an apparently indifferent memory, and it invariably points to the participation of motive in the formation of the disturbance. The distorting of names amounts to an insult when done intentionally, and could have the same significance in a whole series of cases where it appears as unintentional speech blunders. The person who, according to Mayer's report, once said Freuder instead of Freud, because shortly before he pronounced the name, Breuer, and who at another time spoke of the Feyerabdian method, was certainly not particularly enthusiastic over this method. Later, under the mistakes, writing, I shall report case of name disfigurement which certainly admits of no other explanation. As disturbing element in these cases there is an intermingling of criticism which must be omitted, because at the time being it does not correspond to the intention of the speaker, or it may be just the reverse. The substituted name, or the adoption of the strange name, signifies an appreciation of the same. The identification which is brought about by the mistake is equivalent to recognition which for the moment must remain in the background. An experience of this kind from his school days is related by Dr. Ferenczi. While in my first year at college I was obliged to recite a poem before the whole class. It was the first experience of the kind in my life, but I was well prepared. As soon as I began my recitation I was dismayed at being disturbed by an outburst of laughter. The professor later explained to me this strange reception. I started by giving the title out from the distance, which was correct, but instead of giving the name of the real author, I mentioned my own. The name of the poet is Alexander Batofi. The identity of the first name with my own favored the interchange of names, but the real reason was surely the fact that I identified myself at that time with the celebrated poet hero. Even consciously I entertained for him a love and respect which verged on adoration. The whole ambition complex hides itself under this faulty action. Similar identification was reported to me concerning a young physician who timidly and reverently introduced himself to the celebrated Virchow with the following words, I am Dr. Virchow. The surprised professor turned to him and asked, Is your name also Virchow? I do not know how the ambitious young man justified his speech blunder, whether he thought of the charming excuse that he imagined himself so insignificant next to this big man that his own name slipped from him, or whether he had the courage to admit that he hoped that he, too, would some day be as great a man as Virchow, and that the professor should therefore not treat him in too disparaging manner. One or both of these thoughts may have put this young man in an embarrassing position during the introduction. Owing to very personal motives, I must leave it undecided whether similar interpretation may also apply in the case to be cited. At the International Congress in Amsterdam, in 1907, my theories of hysteria were the subject of lively discussion. One of my most violent opponents, in his diatribe against me, repeatedly made mistakes in speech in such a manner that he put himself in my place and spoke in my name. He said, for example, Breuer and I is well known, have demonstrated, etc. when he wished to say Breuer and Freud. The name of this opponent does not show the slightest sound similarity to my own. From this example, as well as from other cases of interchanging names in speech blunders, we are reminded of the fact that the speech blunder can fully forego the facility afforded to it through similar sounds, and can achieve its purpose if only supported in content by concealed relations. In other and more significant cases it is a self-criticism, an internal contradiction against one's own utterance, which causes the speech blunder, and even forces contrasting substitution for the one intended. We then observe with surprise how the wording of an assertion removes the purpose of the same, and how the error in speech lays bare the inner dishonesty. Here the lapsus linguae becomes mimicking form of expression, often, indeed, for the expression of what one does not wish to say. It is thus means of self-betrayal. Breuer relates, I had recently been consulted by a woman who showed many paranoid trends, and as she had no relatives who could cooperate with me, I urged her to enter our state hospital as voluntary patient. She was quite willing to do so, but on the following day she told me that her friends with whom she leased an apartment objected to her going to hospital, as it would interfere with their plans, and so on. I lost patience and said, There is no use listening to your friends who know nothing about your mental condition. You are quite incompetent to take care of your own affairs. I meant to say competent. Here the lapsus linguae expressed my true opinion. Favored by chance, the speech material often gives origin to examples of speech blunders which serve to bring about an overwhelming revelation or a full comic effect, as shown by the following examples reported by Brill. A wealthy but not very generous host invited his friends for an evening dance. Everything went well until about 11:30 p.m., when there was an intermission, presumably for supper. To the great disappointment of most of the guests there was no supper. Instead, They were regaled with thin sandwiches and lemonade. As it was close to election day, the conversation centered on the different candidates, and as the discussion grew warmer, one of the guests, an ardent admirer of the Progressive Party candidate, remarked to the host, "You may say what you please about Teddy, but there is one thing he can always be relied upon. He always gives you a square meal, wishing to say square deal." The assembled guests burst into a roar of laughter, to the great embarrassment of the speaker and the host, who fully understood each other. While writing prescription for a woman who was especially weighed down by the financial burden of the treatment, I was interested to hear her say suddenly, Please do not give me big bills, because I cannot swallow them." Of course she meant, say pills. The following example illustrates a rather serious case of self-betrayal through mistake in talking. Some accessory details justify full reproduction as first printed by Dr. A. Brill, while walking one night with Dr. Frank, we accidentally met colleague Dr. P., whom I had not seen for years, and of whose private life I knew nothing. We were naturally very pleased to meet again, and on my invitation he accompanied us to a cafe, where we spent about 2 hours in pleasant conversation. To my question as to whether he was married, he gave a negative answer, and added, "Why should man like me marry?" On leaving the cafe, he suddenly turned to me and said, "I should like to know what you would do in case like this. I know a nurse who was named as correspondent in divorce case. The wife sued the husband for divorce and named her as correspondent, and he got the divorce." I interrupted him, saying, "You mean she got the divorce?" He immediately corrected himself, saying, she got the divorce," and continued to tell how the excitement of the trial had affected this nurse to such an extent that she became nervous and took to drink. He wanted me to advise him how to treat her. As soon as I had corrected his mistake, I asked him to explain it, but as is usually the case, he was surprised at my question. He wanted to know whether a person had no right to make mistakes in talking. I explained to him that there is reason for every mistake, and that if he had not told me that he was unmarried, I would say that he was the hero of the divorce case in question, and that the mistake showed that he wished he had obtained the divorce instead of his wife, so as not to be obliged to pay alimony and to be permitted to marry again in New York State. He stoutly denied my interpretation, but his emotional agitation, followed by loud laughter only, strengthened my suspicions. To my appeal that he should tell the truth for science sake, he said, "Unless you wish me to lie, you must believe that I was never married, and hence your psychoanalytic interpretation is all wrong." He, however, added that it was dangerous to be with a person who paid attention to such little things. Then he suddenly remembered that he had another appointment and left us. Both Frank and I were convinced that my interpretation of his lapsus linguae was correct, and I decided to corroborate or disprove it by further investigation. The next day, I found a neighbor, an old friend of Dr. P., who confirmed my interpretation in every particular. The divorce was granted to Dr. P.'s wife a few weeks before, and a nurse was named as correspondent. A few weeks later I met Dr. P., and he told me that he was thoroughly convinced of the Freudian mechanisms. The self-betrayal is just as plain in the following case reported by Otto Rank, father who is devoid of all patriotic feeling and desirous of educating his children to be just as free from this superfluous sentiment, reproached his sons for participating in patriotic demonstration, and rejected the reference to similar behavior of their uncle with these words, "You are not obliged to imitate him. Why, he's an idiot." The astonished features of the children at their father's unusual tone aroused him to the fact that he had made mistake, and he remarked apologetically, "Of course, I wish to say patriot." When such speech blunder occurs in serious squabble and reverses the intended meaning of one of the disputants, at once it puts him at disadvantage with his adversary, a disadvantage which the latter seldom fails to utilize. This clearly shows that although people are unwilling to accept the theory of my conception and are not inclined to forego the convenience that is connected with the tolerance of all faulty action, they nevertheless interpret speech blunders and other faulty acts in manner similar to the one presented in this book. The merriment and derision which are sure to be evoked at the decisive moment through such linguistic mistakes speak conclusively against the generally accepted convention that such speech blunders are lapsus linguae and psychologically of no importance. It was no less a man than the German Chancellor, Prince Bülow, who endeavored to save the situation through such a protest when the wording of his defense of his emperor, November 1907, turned into the opposite speech blunder. Concerning the present, the new epoch of Emperor Wilhelm Roman, I can only repeat what I said a year ago, that it would be unfair and unjust to speak of our coterie of responsible advisers around our emperor. Loud calls, responsible. Speak of irresponsible advisers. Pardon the lapsus linguae. Hilarity. Nice example of speech blunder, which aims not so much at the betrayal of the speaker as at the enlightenment of the listener outside the scene, is found In Wallenstein, Piccolomini, Act I, Scene 5, and shows us that the poet who here uses this means is well versed in the mechanism and intent his speech blunders. In the preceding scene, Max Piccolomini was passionately in favor of the ducal party, and was enthusiastic over the blessings of the peace which became known to him in the course of our journey while accompanying Wallenstein's daughter to the encampment. He leaves his father and the court ambassador, Questenberg, in great consternation. The scene proceeds as follows. Questenberg, woe unto us! Are matters thus? Friend, should we allow him to go there with this false opinion, and not recall him at once in order to open his eyes instantly? Octavio, rousing himself from profound meditation. He has already opened mine, and I see one and pleases me. Questenberg, what is it, friend? Octavio, curse on that journey. Questenberg, why? What is it, Octavio? Come, I must immediately follow the unlucky trail, must see with my own eyes. Come, wishes to lead him away. Questenberg, what is the matter? Where? Octavio urging. To her. Questenberg. Octavio corrects himself. To the Duke. Let us go, etc. The slight speech blunder to her in place of to him is meant to betray to us the fact that the father has seen through his son's motive for espousing the other cause, while the courtier complains that he speaks to him altogether in riddles. Another example wherein a poet makes use of a speech blunder was discovered by Otto Rank in Shakespeare. I quote Rank's report from the Zentralblatt, first Psychoanalyse, I. 3. Poetic speech blunder, very delicately motivated and technically remarkably well utilized, which, like the one pointed out by Freud in Wallenstein's Zur Psychopathology des Alltagslebens, 2nd edition, p. 48, not only shows that poets knew the mechanism and sense of this error, but also presupposes an understanding of it on the part of the hearer, can be found in Shakespeare's Merchant of Venice, Atroma Scene 2. By the will of her father, Portia was bound to select husband through lottery. She escaped all her distasteful suitors by lucky chance. When she finally found in Bassanio the suitor after her own heart, she had cause to fear lest he, too, should draw the unlucky lottery. In the scene she would like to tell him that even if he chose the wrong casket, he might, nevertheless, be sure of her love, but she is hampered by her. Now, in this mental conflict the poet puts these words in her mouth, which were directed to the welcome suitor. There is something tells me, but it is not love. I would not lose you, and you know yourself. A counsels not in such quality. But lest you should not understand me well, and yet maiden hath no tongue but thou, I would detain you here some month or two, before you venture for me. I could teach you how to choose right, but then I am forsworn, so will I never be. So may you miss me, but if you do, you'll make me wish sin that I had been forsworn. Beshrew your eyes, they have o'erlooked me, and divided me. One half of me is yours, the other half yours, mine own, I would say, but if mine, then yours, and so all yours. Just the very thing which she would like to hint to him gently, because really she should keep it from him, namely, that even before the choice she is wholly his, that she loves him. The poet, with admirable psychologic sensitiveness, allows to come to the surface in the speech blunder. It is through this artifice that he manages to lay the intolerable uncertainty of the lover as well as the like tension of the hearer concerning the outcome of the choice. The interest merited by confirmation of our conception of speech blunders through the great poets justifies the citation of a third example which was reported by Dockery Jones. Our great novelist George Meredith, in his masterpiece, The Egoist, shows an even finer understanding of the mechanism. The plot of the novel is shortly as follows. Sir Willoughby Patterne, an aristocrat greatly admired by his circle, becomes engaged to Miss Constantia Durham. She discovers in him an intense egoism, which he skilfully conceals from the world, and to escape the marriage she elopes with a captain Oxford. Some years later Patterne becomes engaged to a Miss Clara Middleton, and most of the book is taken up with a detailed description of the conflict that arises in her mind on also discovering his egoism. External circumstances and her conception of honor hold her to her pledge, while he becomes more and more distasteful in her eyes. She partly confided in his cousin and secretary Vernon Whitford, the man whom she ultimately marries, but from a mixture of motives he stands aloof. In the soliloquy Clara speaks as follows: "If some noble gentleman could see me as I am and not disdain to aid me, oh, to be caught out of this prison of thorns and brambles! I cannot tear my own way out. I am coward. Beckoning a finger would change me, I believe. I could fly bleeding and through hootings to comrade." Constantia met soldier. Perhaps she prayed, and her prayer was answered. She did ill. But oh, how I love her for it! His name was Harry Oxford. She did not waver. She cut the links. She signed herself over. Oh, brave girl, what do you think of me? But I have no Harry Whitford. I am alone. The sudden consciousness that she had put another name for Oxford struck her buffet, drowning her in crimson. The fact that both men's names end in F word evidently renders the confounding of them more easy, and would by many be regarded as an adequate cause for this, but the real underlying motive for it is plainly indicated by the author. In another passage the same lapsus occurs, and is followed by the hesitation and change of subject at one. Familiar within psychoanalysis when half-conscious complex is touched, Sir Willoughby patronizingly says of Whitford, "False alarm. The resolution to do anything unaccustomed is quite beyond poor old Vernon." Clara replies, "But, Iphister Oxford, Whitford, your swans coming sailing up the lake, how beautiful they look when they are indignant. I was going to ask you, surely men witnessing marked admiration for someone else will naturally be discouraged." Sir Willoughby stiffened with sudden enlightenment. In still another passage Clara, by another lapsus, betrays her secret wish that she was on a more intimate footing with Vernon Whitford. Speaking to boy friend, she says, "Tell Mr. Vernon." Tell Mr. Whitford. The conception of speech blunders here defended can be readily verified in the smallest details. I have been able to demonstrate repeatedly that the most insignificant and most natural cases of speech blunders have their good sense and admit of the same interpretation as the more striking examples. A patient who, contrary to my wishes but with firm personal motives, decided upon a short trip to Budapest, justified herself by saying that she was going for only 3 days, but she blundered and said for only 3 weeks. She betrayed her secret feeling that, despite me, she preferred spending 3 weeks to 3 days in that society which I considered unfit for her. One evening, wishing to excuse myself for not having called for my wife at the theater, I said, "I was at the theater at 10 minutes after 10. I was corrected. You meant to say, before 10 o'clock. Naturally, I wanted to say, before 10. After 10 would certainly be no excuse. I had been told that the theater program read finished before 10 o'clock. When I arrived at the theater, I found the foyer dark and the theater empty. Evidently the performance was over earlier, and my wife did not wait for me. When I looked at the clock, it still wanted 5 minutes to 10. I determined to make my case more favorable at home, and say that it was 10 minutes to 10. Unfortunately, the speech blunder spoiled the intent and laid bare my dishonesty, in which I acknowledged more than there really was to confess. This leads us to those speech disturbances which can no longer be described as speech blunders, for they do not injure the individual word, but affect the rhythm and execution of the entire speech, as, for example, the stammering and stuttering of embarrassment. But here, as in the former cases, it is the inner conflict that is betrayed to us through the disturbance in speech. I really do not believe that any one will make mistakes in talking in an audience with His Majesty, in serious love declaration, or in defending one's name and honor before juror. In short, people make no mistakes where they are all there, as the saying goes. Even in criticizing an author's style we are allowed, and accustomed to follow the principle of explanation, which we cannot miss in the origin of a single speech blunder. Clear and unequivocal manner of writing shows us that here the author is in harmony with himself, but where we find forced and involved expression, aiming at more than one target as appropriately expressed, we can thereby recognize the participation of an unfinished and complicated thought, or can hear through it the stifled voice of the author's self-criticism. This has been part 2 of Psyched for Psychology's reading of Freud's The Psychopathology of Everyday Life, 1901. Thanks for listening.